Welcome to A Healthy Dose. I'm Julie Stautland, and in part one of our conversation with Amanda Achtman, founder of Dying to Meet You, we walked through the rapid and troubling expansion of Made in Canada and the stories of people like Roger Foley and Miriam Lancaster and Larry Holland, as people may know, who were offered assisted dying when they were never asking for it. In part two, we turn toward action, what you can do, what must change, and why Amanda Achtman refuses to give up. Thank you again for joining me, Amanda.
My
So
pleasure.
let's jump in. Before we move into solutions, I want to sit in the weight of this a little longer. You've heard hundreds of these stories through Dying to Meet You. What has this work cost you personally? How do you carry it?
Honestly, I would say thinking about death every day is one of the most enlivening things. It
Hmm.
has made my life deeper, richer, and has reminded me that my life is not just my own, but is
Wow.
meant to be lived for the sake of others. And coming alongside people in their suffering, I realize that the true meaning of compassion, as an author I like very much has put it, is a communion in suffering of those who love. And
Hmm.
so that is kind of what this journey of discovery entails because I really cherish each of my encounters with people who share their stories with me. And that's really what it's all about. That's also what keeps me so hopeful because I think, even in the midst of the things that I've suffered, what
Yeah.
transforms the suffering is when there is a presence, when there is
Hmm.
another. And all sorrows can be born, as the writer Isaac Dinesen put it, all sorrows can be born if you can put it in a story or tell a story about it. And so we need
Wow.
to help each other with the meaning making of our life's suffering. And that's another thing that I try and share with the seniors
Hmm.
to whom I speak. Most of the people who I'm speaking to are older
Yeah.
adults, and I try to insist on how um, your death will send a message. Your
Hmm.
death will send a message. And so, what do you want to say by how you die?
Now,
What do you have to
do you have one story, without having to identify the person, if they haven't gone public, that has changed you more than any other, that made the stakes of this work, like, feel most real?
Oh, there are so many, but I will say that one of the first people I interviewed is Christine. And as soon as I returned from my studies abroad to Canada, everyone said, "You have to go talk to Christine." But
Mm.
she doesn't have a computer, she doesn't have an email address. So I had no idea how I was even going to find her. But eventually, her friends connected us and we met at a coffee shop, first of all. And then I visited her several more times at her senior's home. And Christine is someone who always discouraged her children from ever getting tattoos. But then she decided to get a tattoo in her 80s that says, "Don't euthanize me," right on her arm. Once the
Really?
government euthanasia, she literally got that tattooed on her in her 80s.
Wow.
And her adult children got such a kick out of that that she was then going into this tattoo parlor to make her statement. And she said, "Well, you lose your wallet, you lose your purse, and so I don't want to have a card with my wishes that
There you go.
get forgotten, and so this will be with me forever," she says. And so I was working on kind of and basically I asked her if she would be willing to share her story,
Yeah.
and she said, "Yeah, sure." And so we made a video together. But what most touched me is that it was only when the cameras were rolling that she said that she had attempted suicide earlier in her life. And to
Wow.
me, this was very moving because we had had several visits. We had kind of become friends over that time together. But it was only when she had the sense that now is the moment. If ever there
Mm.
was a time to reveal my vulnerability, it's now. And so I realized how there is credibility in
Yeah.
vulnerability, and
Mhm.
that her testimony speaks much louder than someone who is like moralizing or uh, expressing an opinion. No, like what
Mhm.
we need is we need to speak from our own weakness. And that has kind of moved me to admit that I don't
Mm.
come to this issue from a position of superiority.
Mm.
I come to it because I think I could not trust myself in a moment of weakness. or
Right.
vulnerability not to be tempted by this.
Right.
And so I think just that kind of recognition that
Mm.
we need others to be our advocates in those times.
Okay, let's get practical. If someone watching tonight or today has an elderly parent, a disabled sibling, a chronically ill spouse who is going to be interacting with the healthcare system, what concrete steps can they take right now to protect that person?
As many of the physicians with whom I work on these issues would say, make sure that you can be an advocate to the person who is in the hospital or interacting with the healthcare system. Go with them. Don't leave
Okay.
them to go to appointments or things like that on their own. It's really important to have someone with you, even
Mm.
simply to remember all of the things that you're told, which are hard to receive when you're a patient. It's too
Mm.
much information and anxiety often. So I think, yeah, like be present is important. Now, a lot of people are concerned about being a burden, burdening their family members with whatever they might be going through.
Right.
And um, what I think helps is to reassure the loved ones in your life that, contrary to being a burden, you are actually a gift.
Mm.
And what would burden me is you not sharing your life with me. What would burden me is your premature death. But you are not a burden. And so I think, like, how do we kind of reveal that ahead of time? Because this feeling like a burden is very common, is very interior, and needs to be met with a rebuttal.
Right.
What someone is saying, like they're worried about being a burden, it kind of betrays, I think, a little bit of a false humility, because nobody wants someone to agree and concur that they actually are a burden. You're
Exactly.
you're waiting for the pushback. You're waiting for someone to say, "Oh, but of course you're not a burden to me. I
Mhm.
love you, and it's a joy to take care of you," or
Mhm.
I need you in my life." So I
Mhm.
think practicing those phrases and being
Mhm.
explicit about our affection, which is not something that Canadians do very much. I think we could learn a lot from kind of the warmer cultures that are a little bit more effusive in
Mm.
the affirmation and affection that we give. And so thinking, what is it that's true about this person that you love that you haven't told them, that you could state very explicitly and directly? Because
Mm.
especially in a culture where that's not that typical, when you say to someone something like, I need you in my life, or
Mhm.
you are a gift, or I enjoy spending time with you, or I'm glad that you're here, or you have a place among us, or any of these things, they're so startling because it's just rare for us to speak that way. But they're not that dramatic a thing to say. They're
But
pretty
what
natural.
about what about someone who lives alone though? You know, what about them? Is there any safeguards for them?
Well, interesting phrase, safeguards, that comes up a lot in the euthanasia debate. I don't know if we need to speak about safeguards, but is there anything for them? Let's just
Yeah.
keep it even more basic than that.
Sure.
What about the one who is alone?
Mhm.
Great question, because for sure, loneliness and abandonment are huge drivers of the euthanasia temptation. And we can even think in our own lives of experiences of loneliness, abandonment,
Right.
or alienation where giving up becomes much more of a temptation. And
Mhm.
so, um, the first thing is, I would say, for those who do have contact with this person, there is that responsibility to affirm the goodness of their life. And people in healthcare do this all the time. I was just listening to a social worker share with me about how she says to patients, okay, yes, I may be the only one you're interacting with, but I look forward to seeing you each day. And
Aw,
for some patients, that's dramatic enough to revive their sense of worth and having a place.
I
The other
believe
thing is
that.
to look around
Yes.
and pay attention to those who are alone. Why don't we have a preference
Mm.
for those who are alone? That requires an added effort, an added
Right.
going out of ourselves. But like, those are the persons who deserve a priority of
Mhm.
our attention. And yet, even among those who are full of goodwill and doing many things right, there's so much self-protective, insular closing in upon maybe an immediate family unit or
Mm.
something like that, that prevents us from having a more expansive vision of family that
Right.
attends to those and thinks everyone has a place and deserves to be included.
I only have 30 seconds left, but I do want to ask you about healthcare workers. Is there any protection for those who morally they are against being involved in MAID? Is there anything to protect them?
Technically, the criminal code does have a provision that says no individual practitioner will be compelled to provide euthanasia against their conscience or convictions, but there's a lot of professional peer pressure, and institutions don't have those same protections.
All right, we're going to leave it right there, and we'll be back with policy and politics. Now, you have worked inside the political system as a senior advisor to a member of parliament and outside it through Advocacy and Dying to Meet You. What specific legislative or regulatory changes are you currently fighting for?
Right now, there's currently a review of the expansion of MAID on the basis of mental illness underway by a parliamentary committee. And this law, expanding euthanasia on the basis of mental illness as a sole condition, did pass on March 17th, 2021, but its implementation has been delayed. It was initially delayed by 2 years, and then by another year, and then delayed again until March 17th, 2027. But unless there is an act of legislation, that will take effect, and people will qualify or be eligible, I hate to even use such terms, for a premature death through euthanasia, whose sole underlying medical condition is a mental illness. The other point I'd raise is people with mental illness are already being euthanized, but they have a compounding disability, neurological condition, or otherwise qualifying condition. So this is the situation now. Euthanasia on the basis of mental illness as a sole condition is hugely unpopular among Canadians, I think, and also among psychiatrists. All of the chairs of psychiatry across Canada have spoken against this expansion and have said the reason why is because it's impossible to differentiate suicidal ideation from a reasonable MAID request, and it's also impossible to predict with sufficient accuracy irremediability within the realm of psychiatry. And so for those reasons, the profession is very united in opposing it. The committee has been hearing from so many witnesses speaking out against this expansion on the basis of mental illness, people from all different backgrounds, professional experiences, some family advocates whose loved ones were euthanized, such as Alicia Duncan, whose mother was euthanized 4 hours after being released from a psych ward for a suicide attempt.
You got to be kidding me.
Wow. And she testified before Parliament, and she has a book coming out this summer.
Wow.
Yes. So this
okay, but let's just stop there for a second and then flip the coin and say, okay, but one of the core arguments for the original 2016 legislation was that without legal MAID, people would simply travel abroad or use cruder means, that legalization would at least create a regulated, dignified process. Now that we're almost a decade in, has that argument even held up?
The first thing I want to say there is that medical assistance in dying in Canada is an umbrella term to cover both euthanasia and assisted suicide, with an important distinction between the two. Euthanasia is where the doctor or nurse directly administers the lethal injection. Assisted suicide is where the patient must self-administer. Okay. Now, in the US, there is only assisted suicide, and the numbers are much, much lower, even in jurisdictions that are comparable to Canada in other respects. And the reason is because requiring self-administration is a deterrent, because when someone asks for euthanasia, they can outsource the responsibility to the doctor, whereby the doctor says, I'm just fulfilling the patient's wishes, and the patient says, I'm just undergoing a medical procedure. And so it is not true that people who that if we didn't have euthanasia, many people would commit suicide. The problem is, by creating the appearance and facade of this being healthcare, way more people are opting for it because they're simply receiving a lethal injection at the hands of doctors. It doesn't seem dramatic. It doesn't seem the same action, but it is, as even the former Liberal Justice Minister put it, MAID is a species of suicide. That was how he described it.
Huh.
And so we've got to pay attention to the blurring of these lines, to the erosion of our sensitivity on these issues. I want to briefly mention that while I do believe that the government will actually prevent or scrap this expansion of MAID on the basis of mental illness as a sole condition, what I anticipate is the biggest rising risk is so-called advance requests, death for dementia. And I would encourage everyone listening to pay attention to seeing the value of people with dementia, to affirming their place in community. This can happen to any of us, to all of us. And so it is so important that we understand what it's going to take to prevent the dehumanization of people with dementia, because already in Quebec, there are so many making advance requests to die upon receiving this diagnosis.
Wow. Okay. Well, we're going to pause there and we'll be right back after the break. All of this can seem so hopeless and overwhelming. So, how do we regain a sense of optimism for change? Amanda, the project called Dying to Meet You, not fighting MAID or stop euthanasia now, there's something deliberate about that gentleness, that curiosity, that openness. What kind of conversations do you want to start that the harder edge advocacy can't reach?
Thank you for that beautiful question. I think that the phrase dying to meet you really demonstrates how the remedy is a culture of encounter. Encounter is what transforms this entire conversation. And in particular, I think about those with disabilities who, when they speak and when they share, and when you look at the life that someone bears witness to, that may at glance seem so terrifying, and you see a person living with meaning, living with depth, living in such a way that you could almost wish to have the insight that they do by virtue of all that they've needed to cultivate. I think this is what's really, really transformative. Now, when we become impoverished as a society is when we lose the possibility to encounter people not like us. I really like how Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks used to say that it's the people not like us who make us grow.
Wow.
It's the people not like us who make us grow. And if we eliminate or exclude the people not like us, we are stunting our growth and development as a culture, as an individual. And so I don't hesitate to say, especially to the older audiences to whom I speak, I'm watching how you die, so do it well. It really matters. It really matters. And it's going to send a message. Are we going to be able to be raised up with fortitude, with courage, with resilience, or not? Because another angle that I've been focused on is the impact of euthanasia on the adult grandchildren, because most people are the millennials, for example, who are losing their grandparents to this. And so I interviewed a woman named Lovani who speaks about how her grandmother was the strongest person she knew, the force of strength, the matriarch of the family. And Lovani says that her grandmother chose to give up, chose to ask for MAID because she was ashamed and embarrassed about her dependency and fearful about what the future might hold. And so Lovani says, I'm someone who struggled with my own mental health. And so if the strongest woman in my entire life chose to give up, then do I even stand a chance?
Wow.
And I think showing that intergenerational toll, showing that complex trauma, and this is what we need in order to heal our culture across generations. Because
let me ask you this, since you mentioned about the grandchild, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, what would you say to the young people today that they're growing up with this as normal, that MAID is available and this is normal? What would you want them to understand?
I would say young people have an experience of being told, you have a mission in life, you have a purpose, something great is being expected of you. We grow up with these phrases. In North America, for sure, we are raised in this way, with lots of promise, with lots of hope staked on us. Well, I would say to young people, you've got to give that to the elderly. How can you
Mm,
give the same message that we've been given by
mm,
motivational speakers in high schools, by people who come and do a day-long workshop with us? How can we reciprocate that kind of self-esteem building
mm.
among the older generations? That's what I think
Wow.
is so interesting is like and honestly, it's quite funny because when I was in high school, I took a little career quiz and the top 2 results were funeral director and motivational speaker.
You have married those very well.
That seems to be where all
Oh.
of this, leads. Yeah.
So you have 20 seconds. What would you say to the one person who's considering it?
You belong in the world. It's good you exist, and how your story ends is going to change the meaning of every page. I will come meet you. I'm dying to meet you, and there's someone who needs you and you need them, so stay engaged in life.
Amanda, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Take care.
Amanda Achtman, founder of Dying to Meet You and one of the most important voices in Canada on the question of what it means to care for the dying rather than hasten their deaths. To learn more, visit dyingtomeetyou.com. If this conversation moved you, share it because these are stories that need to be heard.